Good evening, if it's evening for you where you are, and otherwise good morning or good afternoon if you're watching this in another time zone or a different time of day. So welcome to our weekly Neurofeedback and Chill Biohacking live stream, where the format is to hang out for about an hour and do a little bit of neurofeedback and talk about some aspect of the brain that we can usually learn something about, and by learning about it, learn to take control over our different brain phenomena. And tonight the topic is sensory and social processing, and I've lumped them together because they share a lot of the same tissue, or at least the way that I think about regulating these areas. It's very, very similar, and there are some physical overlaps between these systems, and I'll give you some examples of sort of how that makes sense. And the format, if you haven't been to one before, is I'll do a short neurofeedback session that might be related to the particular complaint or topic or goal we're talking about. And while I'm doing that, or towards the end, I'll shift over to talking about the brain phenomena, the brain resources involved in that, and then some brain and non-brain, some neurofeedback and non-neurofeedback style interventions that might be able to help you push your brain around. So if we haven't met before, I'm Andrew Hill. I'm the owner of Peak Brain, and please let me know if there's any questions. Those of you who are live, I see folks showing up. Thanks so much. Hey, Radar. Hey, Bonnie. Sound is soft. Okay. As usual, huh? We're having more audio. Let's see. I'll turn my audio all the way up. Okay, my audio is all the way up. Why is there not any more audio? Let's see. That's about all I can do. Maybe I can do something here. Let's see. I just did that. I bet that helped a lot. Bonnie, if you could confirm to me that the audio got a little bit better. I have audio problems maybe half the time as we set up. So I think that's okay. Let me see. So I'm going to shift over to setting up a neurofeedback session while you guys tell me if the audio is sufficiently loud now. Hey, Fred. Thanks for joining us. Put the microphone closer. Microphone's like not that far away. Thanks for the confirmation that it's better, Bonnie. I appreciate that. All right, so I'm going to set myself up. Hey, Dave. Thanks for joining. I'm going to set myself up for a session. Now, we're going to talk about social and sensory, and I like to get to the TLDR at the beginning a little bit for those of you who may have a YouTube only attention span and it's already been 4 or 5 minutes. The front of the brain is largely about the inside self, and the back of the brain is largely about the outside world. Let me say that again. The front of the brain is about the inside self. The back of the brain is about the outside world. And so as you experience things at a highly conceptual and abstract level, a very self-driven level, it's very anterior, in front of the midpoint. It's frontal lobe to some extent. And as you're drinking in information or making the meaning of that information, it's really behind the midpoint, the central point in the brain. And we'll talk about specific tissues involved, but that's really the thrust of this talk is look at the QEEG and think about what different areas might be involved with regards to sensory and social processing. And the vast majority of them, with a couple of exceptions, are driven by things behind the ears or further back. So, okay, thanks for the volume check-ins, guys. I appreciate that. And as always, please lay your questions on me. I'm going to set up my session. I'm taking the headset off, which means I can't hear myself anymore. So for some reason, I start like looking far away and talking. You can remind me. Let me change the client. Already got that client. Let me plan the client session. So I'm using Eager. I should update. I think there's been a new release or two since I last checked. Okay, so I'm going to do a C4 minus PZ, which is a form of SMR training. And it's a form that ties in a couple different theories about how training is happening. And now C4, the right motor cortex, is very involved with the inhibition and steering, the guidance of behavior, the supervisory system is how I think about it. You know, it's your passenger seat in the car, reading the map and telling you where to turn, and scolding you for driving too fast, perhaps, if you should slow down. It reminds you, it monitors, it supervises, and it does provide this sort of inhibitory tone, this pulling back tone. And with a lack of C4, it can be hard to inhibit incoming information. And a lot of the tissue we'll talk about tonight is driven by phenomena that are on the back right quadrant for many of us. So that's often a place to consider when we get into social and sensory. We also often want to get into the cingulates, into the Z-line sites. So FZ, anterior cingulate, and PZ, posterior cingulate. In this case, I'm doing a protocol of C4 minus PZ and doing a low beta protocol. And that should create, for me, some toning, if you will, in both the posterior cingulate and the right precentral gyrus. And I'll unpack a little bit about what those things do in a moment, but it also gets into the right temporoparietal junction and all the tissue around it, because you're bracketing that area, so you're picking up the contributions of surrounding tissue, the contributions that are different at those locations as well. So since there's some shared information when you stick wires to the head, if you stick a wire at one spot and another spot, they're picking up information that is instantaneous, that's right underneath the electrode. About half the information, let me set up while I'm talking to you, about half the information will be from under the electrode, and the other half will be from everywhere else mixed together. And so you have to kind of play tricks with how you set up pairs of electrodes, either on the head or the ears, to create a signal that you want to get onto the screen. And based on what you're measuring in reference to, it's a pasted up silver electrode, seems to be on there. I'm going to put a yellow and a green wire. So I'm going to take one of them and put some fresh paste on it and put it on C4 on the right-hand side. This is over the right precentral gyrus. Again, that's supervisor. And it uses a lot of low beta waves to do its job. And it tends to supervise an awful lot of our voluntary attention. It's also involved with a fair amount of physical inhibition, like the ability to sit still, maybe driven to some extent by C4, this right-hand side. Let me get in camera and see how close I am. Those of you who place electrodes can give me feedback on if I'm on the right side of my head and if it's pretty good. Let's see. What do you guys think? I think I'm pretty close to C4. I'm going to move it just a little further over. There we go. The very few benefits of having no hair is wire placement becomes much easier. Getting good EEG signals is not any easier. It's actually kind of harder because you end up with a thicker layer of fat and oil that creates this insulation. So people come in who are bald and always like, oh, it's super easy to do a brain map on me, right? And no, it's not. It's hard. What's also hard is untangling the wires that I've put on my head. Let me just do this. There we go. All right. So I have this other wire to put on PZ. Looking good for C4. Thanks, Dave. Appreciate the check-in. Let's see. Now, PZ is pretty easy for many of us, even though it's in the back. There's different ways to find it. You know, if you're a peak brain client, we help you create a little rope that has knots on the Z-line. Clients that are more recent have been getting little placement nets that have cutouts for locations. So as long as the net is on properly, then you can place individual wires pretty well. But for many of us, PZ is not that hard because many of us have a flat spot sort of toward the back, like at a 45-degree angle. And right in the middle of it is essentially PZ. So if your head does not have a flat spot, if instead it curves out, then the top of the curve, the most posterior part of the curve will be PZ. You know, FZ, in some ways, you can cheat and find FZ if you wanted to by going to the ball of the curve. You know, it's so far forward that it's as forward as you can get before it really becomes the front surface. So I got my wires in, and they're a little tangled, but that's okay. It improves actually slightly. Let me get my amplifier. Here's my amp. I have a cat who wants attention. Nope, this is for me right now. Sorry, cat. So here's my little amplifier, my little pocket Neurobics QWiz, and then my wire ends. I'm going to plug it in where I do C4 minus PZ. So C4 is yellow wire. Pro tip, don't mix colors of wires when you're setting yourself up. Use 2 different or 3 different color scalp wires. Use enough ear clips of different colors to not have the same color on different ears. It's really useful to glance down and sanity check your placements without having to trace wires all over the place, because it's just so easy to make a mistake with which wire is which if you're trying to follow a wire with your eyes. And so what I've done is I've created this little wiring setup, and on this particular amplifier, channel 1 is red minus black. So you can see we have the sockets here. Sorry, I'm reversed in my camera. Red minus black is channel 1. The green socket is my ground, which is my ear. Amp is not lit up. Oh, no, there it goes. It's giving me a status. The whiz amps, you see how it's blinking every so often? That's the status sort of standby, which is exactly what you want from a whiz. It's all kinds of interesting things you can do with a whiz amp, like check impedance in real time, and these amps even have little HEG sockets, little hidden ones now. That's really kind of a pro feature here. So if you want to do PIR HEG, you need different software, but you can do it with these little amps, which is cool because they're still expensive, but they're only about $1,000, which for EEG equipment is pretty cheap. All right, so I got my protocol. It says C4 right now, minus A1. I'm just going to click on PZ. Yep, that did it. And then I'm going to drop the reward frequency down to 11.5 to 14.5 as well. You know, this C4 minus PZ is not like the protocol for sensory or social necessarily. It may be for some people, but for many people, being a bit lower down in that right quadrant might make more sense. And I'll explain a little bit in a moment why. Let me get rid of the title here of the show tonight. There we go. So C4PZ, 4 to 7 inhibit is my setup. 11.5 to 14.5 and 20 to 32. I'll just do that pretty low-key protocol. There we go. And we're going to run it for, let's do 15 minutes. Okay. And I gave no thought to what game we're going to do tonight, but let's just pick something random. What haven't I done in a while? Let's see. I'm just going to be super basic and choose box lights. Box lights has one little wrinkle that's worth talking about. Okay, so my signals don't look great so far. Maybe that's because I'm sitting on a wire or something. Let's see. There we go. That's a better signal. See how it got like thinner all at once? It went from fat and hairy to thin. That means the impedance dropped significantly. So instead of picking up my brainwaves and all of the ambient 50 and 60 hertz noise, depending on which country you're in, now it's just picking up brainwaves. It's pretty good. It's kind of low amplitude, lower amplitude than a ear reference would be. So if it was C4 minus A2 or C4 minus A1, this would be a higher amplitude signal. And the reason is because there's less shared information on my earlobes compared to my scalp. So even though C4 and PZ are kind of far away, make sure this ground is on well. It seems to be. C4 is on solidly. PZ is on solidly. I'm just double checking because it is a little low amplitude. I have my scale set to 20 microvolts and usually get a little higher amplitude signal. But as I was saying, because C4 and PZ are both in the scalp, they're sharing a certain amount of electricity. And let me see, it's almost like my ground isn't, you guys probably can't see, but I'm getting a little bit of low amplitude squiggle, what do you call it? Let's see here. It looks like EEG, it's just very low amplitude. If you look very carefully on the raw trace, the top squiggle, there's a little bit of hairiness or vibration, and that's the residual 60 hertz noise. But I think it's getting in the way somehow of reading because I should have more of an EEG signal. So the way you can tell that is because all of the noise, my blinks and movement, are just all we're seeing. So what I'm going to do is re-paste up my ear, because chances are that there's something going on with the ground, because it looks pretty good broadly. Yeah, see, I pulled the ground wire off my head and it looks the same roughly. This is Eager has a floating ground, or the amp does, I forget which. And if you get a ground established, it can then kind of get stuck reading in a virtual ground before it loses the sense that you've connected the ground. So I'm going to put the ground with fresh paste on. And it could be that it was just picking up not quite enough. Let's see how that feels or looks on the amplifier. Looks about the same. Again, Eager has this virtual ground phenomenon, and sometimes if noise or poor signal's been creeping in, it kind of gets stuck, and so it can be good to restart the session. So let's do box lights. And if this doesn't work, I'm going to reset my amplifier. It's initializing. Still seems it might be low amplitude. Yeah, it kind of is. Let's see. It's getting muscle tension. It's getting movement. How's my amplifier look? Looks like it should look. Everything plugged in properly. I think so. Perhaps I just have a thick scalp, and so my EEG is super low amplitude right now. And I'm starting to get better signal quality. I'm just going to run with it. But you guys can see that I've been doing this for 25 years, and still sometimes you fight with signal quality. So I'm just going to double check something. Oh, that first wire wasn't plugged in quite securely. Second wire plugged in plenty securely now. And then ground plugged in. Yeah, it seems fine. It's getting burst, getting muscle. Cool. All right, I'm just going to run with it. And there we go. I'm getting more variability now. I don't know if you guys can see, but suddenly we're getting a little bit less of that 60 hertz bleeding in, and a little more variability, a little more real EEG. And because these wires are both somewhat far away from my face, they're not picking up much in the way of blinks, but they do still pick up muscle tension and pops. So there's muscle tension, for instance, and a pop is whenever the wire's loose. So, all right, here we go. So let's begin the session. And F5. Okay, so our little blue boxes and yellow boxes and red boxes are showing up. And now I'm going to auto scale it with F11. There we go. Now, turn this down a touch. So we're training, I'm training. You can see little vertical green lines happening. But my game screen is all smushed together, and I want to change that. And on Eager, what you do is you select the middle band, and then you scale it manually. And scaling the band changes the size of the boxes. In this case, my blue box is the middle band. You can see that I'm making, it's very low microvolts. I wonder why I have such, I guess the average is 20 microvolts. It's not super small. Let's go. Yeah, there we go. Now we're getting signals. Okay, I think what happened was my bald head was oily, and it just took a second for the paste to work itself down through the signals, and now we have decent quality. So let me scale this reward band. Right now it's 2 microvolts. I'm going to scale it by hitting F9, and then I'm going to hit minus. As I scale down to 1, the blue box is getting bigger, so now it's going to dominate more of the screen. And then you always want to hit F11 with nothing selected. There we go. Okay, now we're training. All right. And just for fun, I'm going to scale the raw signal down as well. That's 20 right now. Make it 10. That will make it more wild, but that's okay. Let me squeeze any artifact that I get down. Cool. All right. So, question time. Dave's asking, can I say a little more about games versus screen dimming on a video for games? Yeah, I think that simple games work just fine and work really well. I know there's this perspective on learning theory that anticipation creates more learning, more of a dopamine response, but we're so basic, we're so deep down into measuring basic physiology that having anything sort of parameterized, anything applauded in the absence of everything else being applauded, it seems to be specific enough for the brain to learn and be moved. I mean, even though cats enjoyed the chicken broth they were being fed in response to SMR in Dr. Sturman's initial research, they weren't being told to make more SMR. They weren't being told it was a good phenomena. And, since then in humans, there's thousands and thousands of people who've trained who are in comas, who are nonverbal, who don't understand anything, and can't be told to try. And there's some folks that, teenagers especially, that don't want to try and look at their phone the whole time. And it still works to change the brain. So you're training the brain and not the mind largely in neurofeedback. And so I think you can bypass the need for anything especially appetitive or stimulating. You don't really need fancy games to sit there and look at. Now, games can be fun, and it can be really onerous to look at a screen like this if you're an 8-year-old or a 48-year-old maybe, but it's still not ideal to have super, super, super busy things, because that's going to create a lot of potential reactions. And a lot of neurofeedback software packages out there will use videos or movies or TV shows or things for their reward environment, where the screen will either get bigger, or you'll have a picture frame around the screen that will reveal more, or a dimming phenomena, or an audio pass phenomena. And there's a bunch of different ways to do it. And we can do it in Eager. Zucor, which makes some add-on games, has a video player. But I don't use videos for neurofeedback for what I think is a really good reason. And it's never been super well established. Like, the pieces of research haven't been put together, but the different tenets of my theory all hold individually. And so essentially there's a pretty convincing argument that neurofeedback happens through implicit learning, the brain extracting rules from variable information. Really basic low-level associative learning is what we're tapping into. You can do conditioning of the style we're doing on things as simple as neurons, basically operant style conditioning, where you create different types of behavior in very simple organisms. So it doesn't require a huge amount of cognitive, maybe any cognitive power to do this learning, but it does require the brain to perform this statistical extraction thing, where it figures out the patterns that are being presented, and then it looks for ways to get more information, essentially. And that's what we're tapping into in neurofeedback, this pattern of beeps, the blue square swelling hugely in my eye line. While it's a little stimulating visually, stimulating might be too strong a word, it's not relevant really to my cognitive experience. I'm not like, oh yeah, blue square, yeah. Even if someone tells me that the blue square is my beta wave amplitude, right now my beta wave amplitude is 4.8 microvolts. My threshold is 4.1 microvolts, which means I've put a measurement criteria just below where I am. And whenever my brain exceeds that measurement criteria, it allows the beep to happen. It allows those vertical green lines to happen. If you look very carefully, very closely on my game screen, there's a small thin white box on this box lights game. And the thin white box is the amplitude of the threshold. And so when you exceed that, it gives you rewards. And just to complete the explanation, the purple box on the screen and on my traces screen are representing theta, 4.7 microvolts. And that's being trained down. So I'm making 9.5, 10 microvolts, and I put a threshold. I'm making more than that. Let me move my head and see what I'm making. The threshold at 10 microvolts, and I'm making 8 roughly, 7 point something. So I want my theta to go down. So I'm keeping my threshold at 10, And if I exceed the threshold, if my theta briefly surges outside of these lines, then it will create a pause in the reward rate. So pretty basic. And then yellow is my high frequency beta. So I'm training down 4 to 7, training down 20 to 32, training up 11.5. So here's the other piece of my choice not to use videos for Dave and anyone else who's wondering. So implicit learning is required for the style of learning we need to do neurofeedback. Social engagement breaks or floods implicit learning and makes it nearly impossible. The social learning takes over. So the same tissue we use to extract the meaning and the pattern pick up things like the social meaning and the social context and the threat and the reward as it's socially limited and socially bound. And this completely takes over. It's much more important that we learn the social information than that we, figure out if there's a pattern to the animal running by or something. So the social aspects of it become dominant, and they make it really difficult for the brain to do anything with implicit information. And so I'm fairly certain that watching movies as your reward and dimming the screen weakens neurofeedback significantly. And I've seen this, I used to think it was different pieces of software that I used were really doing the job, and the one I chose to use videos with just wasn't that powerful. But no, I really think it's that video can be a reduced impact kind of training modality. And it may be because it's social. It may be sometimes because it's super exciting. If you create this engagement with the material, maybe someone is used to squinting through bad visual experiences. That's less true now in the day of, in our day of 4K and 8K. But I grew up with little tiny TVs with rounded front screens. And, we were used to squinting through stuff that didn't look perfect. So I wonder if the social engagement and the high level of stimulus both get in the way to make it so that the reward stream, the brain's ability to do math on simple stops and starts can be obscured a little bit, essentially. So long-winded answer, but that's why I don't use videos for neurofeedback. Now, I do have some exceptions. If you're a kid or an adult who's, maybe cognitively really challenged, extremely autistic, screaming, moving, will never stop, being resistant, but you'll sit still for that one Shrek video or that one Minions show, guess what we're playing again and again and again. And, when I started off in this field of neurofeedback 25 years ago or so, I can't tell you how many times I watched the first 25 minutes of Shrek, of the Black Stallion, and a few other movies from that time frame that were really hot. So not a huge fan, but if that's the only way someone will sit still to watch neurofeedback happen, then it's better than not doing it, is my take on it. Dave's asking, notice that I always use the audio and visual reinforcement. Why do I think that the brain treats a simple beep as a reward? The Zucker games are very slick but expensive. Yeah, the driving and flying games, we actually use those in most of our offices. Zucker's Air and Zucker's Drive. We like them. They work really well, actually. I think they work as well as these. They can be a little bit difficult with multiple screens and things like that. They have some other, constraints. If you have a weak machine, you'll stutter because the Zucker games are really visually intense. They're cutting edge video game visuals from 20 years ago, which is a lot better than this here, which is cutting edge from 50 or 60 or 70 years ago. Eager has some games called Ardea games. Ardea is like a subset company, and they make several games using the Unity engine that's more 3D, a Lotus game, a Potions game, what's the third one? Postcards. And they're nice, but I find that busier games can maybe not work as well sometimes. I'm not sure why. I think they can create more movement, especially driving and flying early on. People are like, okay, steer this way, steer that way. And it creates noise in the signal, of course, for many protocols. So the Zucker games, when we install them on home use machines, we usually do it because That's the only way an 8-year-old or 5-year-old or whatever will sit still, is watching the driving game or the flying game or, whatever it is. And, it's okay if it takes an extra $500 or $800 a year to license a machine so that a kid can watch a flying pig as the stimulus. Well, then guess what we're doing? We're licensing that on the machine. So I don't think the modality matters that much. I think the brain's pretty good at learning through a noisy signal. You don't have to get a perfect signal either doing neurofeedback, because you're training relative to yourself. So if there's a little bit of muscle tension or a bit of environmental noise, as long as it doesn't overlap the signals you're training in, it's fine. The frequencies you're training in. So the Zucker games do work. I think air might work a tiny bit better than drive. I like them both. I use them both a lot in the offices, certainly. When I did my PhD work, I looked at a simple game that's built into Eager called Formation, a picture grid game that I've done here before. And what I did was I took this event that's happening, the vertical lines in the top trace, and I yoked them into the live real-time signal that I was pulling off participants' heads using a 64-channel dense array EEG cap. And so we ended up doing source analysis of what was happening in the brain, and also a bunch of things called ERPs, or evoked potentials, looking at how the brain was yoking to the information in sort of a time frequency based way. Not just frequency, but also in time. And this created some awareness of how the brain is learning, how the brain is figuring out how to establish the informational loop that's involved with this form of learning. And I think that the brain is looking to learn discrete little bits of information, but tons of them. So we can do all kinds of interesting ways of providing neurofeedback. I think different reward schemes work fine. For years there was arguments about does, automatic thresholding or constant thresholding or super, super rapid thresholding or only every so often thresholding, which one works better? And there's all kinds of theories about, what would work better. But honestly, it all seems to work as long as you're providing enough information for the brain to do the heavy lifting of the information extraction. So in this case, with Eager, I'm auto thresholding every 30 seconds. Every 30 seconds, I'm moving the computer next to where my brain is, and then waiting for my brain to stay or to move in the proper direction. So I think auto thresholding works fine. I think the simple events, I'm trying to create a condition in my brain under these locations, under these electrodes, where beta's high, SMR has gone up, low beta, and theta goes down. And I can feel that happening. I can feel some SMR in my body, a tiny bit of body relaxation, but I can also feel a little bit of beta going up in the back of my head. I'm a little bit wired right now, a little on it, not on edge, but like I was more chill 15 minutes ago than I am right now, like significantly. So I got a little bit of a body flush and a bit of a focus activation from the C4 SMR effect. And I got a little bit of like visual boost and a little bit of energy from bringing beta up at the back of my head. Now the beta there may actually be alpha. Alpha is up in the 10 to 13 hertz range, as well as the 7 to 10 hertz range. And it feels like my fast alpha is a bit buzzy because I'm not as relaxed. I'm in a bit of a, ready to go kind of mode. So let me unhook myself and answer more questions and talk about sensory things. Where's my misbehaving mouse? There it is. Okay, so let's talk about topic notes. There we go. Well, I unhook myself. So please do feel free to keep throwing in random questions while I have some notes prepared. The goal is not to make this a lecture, but to make it an opportunity to have an AMA. Ask me anything, but to do it in a way that's low-key enough that I'm doing something else, that I'm not either waiting on your questions or trying to like squeeze other content in. On that note, we're coming up on, 12 or 13 or 14 of these things, I think 14. And I've got an article for most of them. So if you look in the show notes, in the description, you'll see links to the website where I have biohacking guides around all of these topics, and they're starting to build up. So if you find them useful, that's great. I also really kind of I'm starting to need topics. I'm totally happy to prepare my perspective as a neuroscientist and as a biohacker on most of these topics and to keep doing it. But at some point, it'll either get reductive or I'll get in the weeds so thoroughly that no one will care what I'm talking about. So I would love if you have additional ideas for me in terms of what would make good neurofeedback and chill topics. And I have a couple criteria for this particular format. One is it's got to have cortical phenomena that we can unpack and I can teach about. And two, there should be some neurofeedback that I can do without complicated setups that I can talk about too. So that's challenging, but that's sort of why I haven't done some of the topics you guys have mentioned, because they're interesting, but they're either super complicated, would take a really complicated setup that would be better in a 5-minute video unpacking a complicated topic as just a standalone. Or, there's some other topic that might make more sense to do first. I've also thought about changing the format a little bit of these neurofeedback and chill, and maybe start doing some neuroscience news kind of reviews every week as well. We have some listeners, some viewers, some people that hang out in Europe, and a couple of them stay up super late and hop on in the middle of the night, but most of them catch it the next day or the day after. And even in California, some folks watch this the next day. And having a morning live stream is starting to become more important as people start to, show up and watch and contribute. So I'm thinking about doing another one that is more news-based, but I also, might convert this one over. So give me some thoughts as you guys decide how you want this to be useful. If you do, either now or later, if you're watching this later on, please, I would love your comments and questions. So leave them for me. And okay, so some comments here. Bonnie's noticing that I was more relaxed at the beginning. You can see it. You can see the effect on me. A little buzzy, tiny bit flushed, a little more up, a little more on. Yeah, it's kind of like a cup of coffee. Kind of nicer than coffee, smoother, brighter, clearer. I got a visual thing going on right now too. Things are really nice and crisp and clear and bright in my dim apartment, which is kind of nice. Dave's saying those papers are extremely valuable. They're exhaustive and full of useful information. Oh, the little biohacking guides. Thank you. Yeah, the Andrew Hill PhD website has a biohacking guide for a bunch of different topics, and I tend to unpack. I don't do a thorough job in every one because often I do them before I meet with you guys. I might answer some specific questions that are on topic or not. And often I kind of think of things that I haven't included in those guides. So the guides are good. I may go back and review them. I probably should revise all of them at some point. But they're really there to backstop future exploration. So if you're like, wait, he didn't explain the neuroscience well enough, it's probably there. Or wait, what was that thing he said about neurofeedback? It's probably there. And if not, you can ask questions as well, and I'll further develop those articles. So let's see. Bonnie has some topics. That's great. Thank you. Radar is asking, is the increased visual acuity from the increased perfusion? Probably, yeah, because it's beta, right? It's fast alpha. So taking my fast alpha in the low teens and raising its amplitude would increase perfusion. But I did it over posterior tissues. So remember my rule in terms of thinking about brain organization. The inside self is pretty far frontal, and the outside world is towards the back. Don't blame me. I didn't put the visual screen that far away from the eyes, but that's where it is. And so I want you to unpack some concepts for this topic tonight. First of all, what is sensory and social stuff? What is having problems there? What does it look like? And the long answer is that it can look like all kinds of things. It can be as simple as having some sensitivity to bright lights, or having kind of a nails on chalkboard experience for certain sounds, like nails on chalkboard, or more commonly, people chewing. It tends to be a driver of irritability. It can be things where you're picking up a lot of social information, a lot of people's anger and frustration, their tone of voice. It can be things like complex social things, reading other people's face expressions and understanding their perspective, their experience, the theory of mind, the other as a separate entity that has thoughts and feelings, and sort of creating a mental image of that person that you empathize with. Having that be too raw, too wide open, where you're picking up too much, or too flooded so you can't tease out the social information. Those can all be social and sensory phenomena. And so we tend to see dysregulations in sensory and social in anxiety, in some ADHD, in autism, in concussions, and post-viral phenomena. So there's all kinds of ways that you might get these sensory and social phenomena kind of thrown off. Now, what are these things? To some extent, the social, I spelled SoCal, I must be projecting here, SoCal and sensory. Social and sensory phenomena, again, are largely behind the ears, back half of the head. But let's get a little more specific and talk about the primary cortices and then secondary and association cortices. So primary means that it's taking input from the outside world. If it's sensory, we have primary auditory cortex right above the ears, and primary visual cortex all the way in the back at the tip of the occipital lobe, just on either side of that bump, basically. And those are really mapped right from the input devices. So we have cochlea in each ear, and it goes through a bunch of other circuits, but it ends up being represented in the cortex near the ears. And each cochlea, each transduction step, so the ears are very complicated. The sound transduction is complicated. It goes through 3 or 4 different steps before you're aware of it. And it starts off as a rarefied air compression wave, and that moves the eardrum. The eardrum transduces that into a mechanical wave of vibrating bones. The vibrating bones turn that into a fluid wave, and now there's fluid washing down the cochlea, and the length of that fluid wave lands on a hair cell. The hair cell is mechanically opened, and based on where the wave lands, and that wave causes firing down the 8th cranial nerve, the vestibuloacoustic nerve. That goes into the brainstem. The olivary nuclei have both sides coming in. They compare both sides, tell where things are happening. And then it goes out into the cortex, and you have the same side connection from the ear and a contralateral side from the ear, both happening. So it's a very complicated, like 8-way system between the thalamic nuclei that I skipped and the brainstem nuclei and the cochlea and all those transduction steps, ridiculously complicated. And this is why we can see auditory processing issues so easily in a QEEG. It's really common for someone to have one side but not the other of an auditory system running a little bit slow, running lots of delta from an old concussion, or tons of beta because they're having trouble filtering the outside world, or low alpha, same thing. And if you see that, then you would know that the two auditory tissues, that really complicated system that has to be kind of run as one, and to make it worse, the auditory system never shuts off. Those bones never stop moving. You can be asleep, bones still vibrating based on sound. And so it's a really expensive system to run. It's also one of the very few systems in the brain that is bilateral, not lateralized left and right, but bilateral. You can't use one ear at a time. If you cover it, doesn't really matter, right? So this phenomena of a very expensive system always pumping an energy into the brain means that if anything gets thrown off, you can see it generally. And you also tend to feel weird things. And so we have these two auditory tissues back there, kind of behind the ears. And if one side and not the other is running lots of delta or theta, slow brain waves, maybe lots of alpha, who knows, then you can sort of know that somebody's auditory experience may be like a car driving with one of those hard plastic tires on one side. You tap the gas for a second and it spins and then catches. And these are people you start talking to and they say, oh, sorry, what? Unless you say, hey, and wait for the orienting and then continue, then you're fine. Then they listen. So those of you who have spacey kids who have ADD diagnoses, make sure it's not just an auditory processing lag. And you'll know that because you can orient them, pause, and then continue. But the same token, we can have phenomena of the visual system getting really overwhelmed. The reason the visual system gets so overwhelmed, the primary visual tissue, occipital 1, V1, all the way in the back, is because it's ridiculously expensive. You close your eyes, it goes into alpha. You open your eyes, it goes into more of a beta wave phenomena, unless you have ADD or something, and then it stays in alpha. And if you close your eyes and you don't see the alpha coming up, then that's hypervigilance or some anxiety because the brain can't relax. The visual system is getting ready to process just in case it's learned that it needs to. So you can see anxiety features sometimes overlapping these sensory tissues as well. But generally, the alpha in the back of the head would tell you if the visual system is coming online or offline. And if someone's had inflammatory phenomena or a concussion, often that tissue back there has been irritated and the world is too bright. It's hard to filter. And you'll see lots of deltas and thetas, disinhibited tissue, and it's kind of sleepy, hard to process the expensive incoming visual. But those are the primary. Those are the place that the information lands. We also have primary motor system, which drives control of the body. About 20 million cells leave the anterior surface, just the back edge of the frontal lobe, and called the primary motor cortex left and right, or the precentral gyri left and right. And this tissue sends down 20 million cells. And I'm bringing it up as a motor system only because I wanted to point something out. The motor system, the control, the descending output system, of those motor neurons, those 20 million neurons that leave the cortical areas of motor control, 19 million of them stop in the cerebellum. 5 million more continue down into the body to do things with motor control. That means 95% of our output motor signal is there to monitor what we're doing with motor control. The cerebellum is doing a comparison of, among other things, between fine motor and gross motor control intentions and what's actually happening. So it's keeping a gain signal, a feedback loop on that system so you can monitor it very carefully. But 95% of the output of motor control is actually spent in monitoring motor control. Even that's mostly sensory. So sensory is huge in terms of the amount of tissue involved in it. All right. Association cortices and secondary cortices will be tissue that takes input from other areas, especially association cortices is integrating other tissues. And then we have organizational principles around the rich clubs, the rich hubs, networks of the executive network, called the central executive often, the salience networks, and the default mode network. These are all sort of the tripartite or the triple network theory. There's a few more networks coming out in theories now. And this whole system is tied into the gut and the heart via the vagus nerve, which you can look at via HRV, heart rate variability. So these are the big components we're working with when we're biohacking. And, I did a C4 minus PZ because I wanted to tie in the posterior cingulate, part of the default mode network that scans and evaluates your lifeguard, and my broad executive on the right-hand side, that supervisor. But if I had a lot of social anxiety or a lot of sensory irritability, I would probably work a bit lower on the right-hand side with the right Temporoparietal Junction. The right TPJ shows up more often than not when there's sensory and social difficulties, when people are flooded or loaded with information. Things get loud, literally loud. And people's anger, their voices, their judgment, their eye contact gets very loud. And we also do things with monitoring again so that we can control output. We do speech monitoring back here on both sides, actually. On the right-hand side, though, is the nonverbal information of speech, prosody, lilt, sort of the rhythm of speech. And so if you're autistic, if you have a lot of difficulty with the verbal aspects of social function, then you might talk like this and have a high-pitched voice all the time because you're not processing, you're not perceiving the prosody, the lilt, the tone of voice yourself, so you don't monitor your own, and it becomes a bit more monotone and often high-pitched. So that's the right-hand side, the more social, nonverbal. Left, just to complete the story, for verbal is more of the meaning, Wernicke's area, more of the meaning of language you're extracting. And then surrounding tissue starts to make sense of that incoming language. So again, on a brain map, you can see these areas as dysregulated frequently because that happens with classic people that are brilliant and anxious and have sensory and social difficulties. You see these same areas in autism being cramped up. You also see these same areas cramped up in concussions, either from sports or car accidents, being T-boned or being hit from the side in sports. Very common to have temporal lobe phenomena. And I don't know why. I don't know if it's the same thing, but we often see temporal lobe blobs of delta and theta in post-viral phenomena, including chronic fatigue, post-COVID, etc. And again, I don't know if it's coming from the viruses and from the metabolic hit that people are taking, or if there's so much wear and tear out there from physical impacts that the new inflammatory phenomena are interacting with old wear and tear. Because very, very common in a post-COVID brain, a couple months later, to have bilateral or even one-sided big giant amounts of delta dominating. And the person will be talking about all of the brain fog and sensory irritability that comes with like a concussion and with extra delta from a concussion as well. So maybe just to illustrate this, that this is not just a pure sensory and social, other phenomena can flare up into the social or sensory and irritate it. You know, traumatic experiences can flare that posterior cingulate really well, and suddenly you have a threat sensitivity. Or if you have some difficulty with secure attachment, these more right front areas that are involved with attachment early in life, if that's difficult, then you may have a lot of social triggering, a lot of rejection sensitivity, perhaps, a lot of anger, a lot of push-pull attachment where you cannot manage feeling challenged or rejected or abandoned without, you know, flipping into a really hard reaction to it and pushing people away, or, you know, all or nothing kind of thinking with regards to relationships. That's a sign of attachment being a little insecure or having some difficulty. It's more of a right front phenomena. But many, many people behind this right ear have this really cramped up area. The right Temporoparietal Junction brings the world in, and all the tissue around it seems to contribute to other aspects of sensory and social. So if you've ever done a brain map with me, and please, if you haven't, come do one. We have a discount. There's a special in the description. It's $250 once a year at the Peak Brain offices for unlimited brain maps within reason. And you can apply that towards a full neurofeedback program as well. If you're not near one of our offices, you can still take $250 off of a remote brain map. They're a little more expensive, but we have a 2-package, and you can do remote mapping. And we have offices in New York City, St. Louis, Orange County, Los Angeles, Stockholm, and London. And again, we can work fully virtually and have partners all over the country and all over the world who can also work with you. So we'll help you find someone if you're not near us. But back to my discussion of the brain, had to slide in a little plug there for Peak Brain. If you've ever done a brain map with me, I describe the brain in terms of characters, individual little personalities who have jobs, very specific jobs. And they kind of do that thing. And if they're not well integrated with other parts of the brain, they can overdo their jobs. This is sort of where we get things like OCD, but also savantism. It's less integration between small modules. Without integration, the modules run super hot, and we get very high running little local circuits, essentially. And that's true of the sensory integration stuff when the behind the right ear is super hot and it can't relax. Some other questions here. Yeah, Bonnie, pitch of voice, especially the rhythm and lilt, the emotional context, that's prosody, P-R-O-S-O-D-Y. And that's a right tempoparietal area phenomena. We also have right next to it the fusiform face area, which is recognizing people's faces. So very, very tied in there behind the right ear. Some other questions here I missed. I'll get back to them, guys. Thanks for reminding me. Let's see. Some topics from Bonnie. Thank you, thank you. Bonnie's asking, how does neurofeedback help mold, Lyme, bipolar, and schizophrenia? So mold and Lyme look really similar on a brain map and respond very well, but you got to be careful. And the same thing about post-COVID and post-concussion, they all look really similar. They all look like brain fog. on a brain map. And you have to move carefully because when people are so taxed and they're so inflamed that it can really exceed people's capacity to be trained. And just like you wouldn't go into a hyperbaric chamber again and again if you felt horrible afterwards, meaning you've exceeded your capacity for oxidative stress. If you feel like you're hit by a truck after some neurofeedback, it means you've probably been overtrained or you can't handle it yet. That can happen really easily if someone's got active Lyme infections or active mold exposure. So it's good to sort of wait till things aren't super acute, even a few days sometimes. If there's been like a recent concussion or a new mold exposure, things settle down pretty quickly in the brain. But you then want to work on the metabolic phenomena alongside the individual components. So often with concussions or mold or Lyme or other neuroinflammatory phenomena, you get tic-type phenomena showing up as well. So after concussion, young athletes, young women will sometimes develop eating disorders, not as a body dysmorphia kind of phenomena, but as almost like an OCD type of phenomena. And people develop tics sometimes after they have a fever or after they have a concussion because of these neuroinflammatory phenomena jacking up the cingulates into high gear or creating discharges sometimes in the temporal lobes if they're motor tics or vocal tics or things. So it's a little complicated in terms of what's happening in those metabolic phenomena, but I think it's important to both target the individual complaints of the individual person, but also to be systemic and work on the 3 legs of the stool for neurofeedback, which are sleep, stress, and attention. And with someone with those kind of foggy phenomena, they're going to have big issues with actual brain fog, with speed of processing, with short-term memory and tip of the tongue and retrieval, with stamina throughout the day kind of phenomena. And there, neurofeedback can do a lot. And you may want to include EEG neurofeedback, HRV biofeedback, HEG neurofeedback for the blood flow training directly for all those phenomena. And then I also include, when I can, when the person has enough resources or access, another big hitter. If someone has big issues like that, then I really would love them to be climbing into a hyperbaric chamber or slapping on a red light therapy helmet and doing, several months of it, or maybe depending on age and goals for other aspects of health, maybe doing some hardcore cycling in and out of a ketosis state so they can create this like powerful anti-inflammatory. My biohacks for people with physical things tend to vary a lot based on what's happening to them physically. So like I care a lot more about someone's carbs if they're having seizures and they want to use diet as an intervention than I do if they're trying to add muscle mass or look good on stage. Different criteria. Or if they're a 7-year-old versus an 80-year-old. So some of these criteria will have other metabolic hacks. Many of them will have other metabolic hacks you can layer in. And I think those are super important for this kind of neuroinflammatory signature stuff, including COVID, mold, Lyme, etc. Now, in terms of bipolar and schizophrenia, and at least for bipolar 1, we're talking about the same phenomena, right? Schizophrenia and bipolar share a lot of genes. And there's prodromal or non-symptomatic or low symptomatic bipolar 1 and schizophrenia in families of people that have those phenomena. It's heavily conserved. And you won't see schizophrenia or bipolar in a brain map. It won't show up as necessarily a particular thing. It will look off. I've seen lots of people with full-blown schizophrenia, with schizoaffective phenomena, with bipolar 1. There is something off, but typically it looks like a mix of fatigue and anxiety. And the anxiety may have front midline and temporal lobe phenomena, it may have sensory and social phenomena, but you don't know someone's experiencing a thought disorder, dysregulated thoughts from the brain maps. They may look OCD or may look like they're having an auditory difficulty, but having an auditory phenomena behind the ear, I often just think it's sensory integration. It can also be auditory hallucinations. I've worked with, more than a dozen people now who've had auditory hallucinations, and they all show an auditory signature on one of the sides, usually the right-hand side, and they're experiencing intrusive auditory stuff that's not under their control. Now, I've worked with lots of people with diagnosed bipolar 1, and I would say some of them do show a mid-temporal phenomenon on the right-hand side, more often than not. but it's just not reliable in the EEG as a signature as such. And same thing with schizophrenia. You know, it looks tired, looks off, looks anxious, looks ADHD, but you can't see a particular phenomena called schizophrenia. I will say that if you're significantly schizophrenic, you know, with some decompensation, some florid behavior, some positive symptoms, some negative symptoms, then neurofeedback can make a world of difference, but it takes about twice as long as I expect every time. You know, someone comes in and I'm like, oh, this person's kind of anxious, a bit scattered, you know, mumbles, has a tic, kind of, you know, okay, some dysregulation here. And we get somewhere, but it's not necessarily as quick as I expect. And I would say in at least 3 cases I'm thinking of actual schizophrenia. I worked with people for maybe 6 months or more, 6 months to a year even, off and on, getting, you know, 100 sessions, 150 sessions in, and they made some change, better improvements in sleep, changes in anxiety, changes in executive function. And for some of them, you would see that. You would see changes, actually all of them, changes in hygiene and things would show up. But in many of them, I was kind of like, well, schizophrenia is too powerful. I haven't been able to make much change. There's something fighting back. And, you know, we got somewhere a little bit, you know, their parents happy or their caregiver or their spouse is happy because there's a difference in how they regulate. But if you've done neurofeedback or worked in it for a while, done it yourself, it usually does a huge amount for people. And so getting moderate effects is often not as satisfying, especially if you work hard at it for 6 months or so. But in all of those cases, every single time, I would get a letter or a note or an email from them a year later, 2 years later, 3 years later, and it was like it was a different person. You know, the person maybe I was getting daily surveys from while they were training. Maybe they were obsessed with going into great detail about the composition of their toilet bowl as a, you know, because they're checking in on their health and have to get super detailed. And it's like, you know, more than obsessive, it's distorted in terms of how they're hyper-focused on it. Or somebody who has major OCD with zero insight, distorted bipolar, intrusive thoughts, hallucinatory stuff, no insight, really concerned whenever it would drop during the neurofeedback, scared by feeling calm, essentially. These people 6 months later, a year later, 2 years later, would send me an email and I'd be like, or talk on the phone, and it was like it was their twin who never had schizophrenia. It was the organized, complete sentences, better boundary, not as pressured. There's a pressured nature in subacute schizophrenia. One of the very common things you'll see is a pressured nature, kind of a you know, kind of thing, and that can turn into fear or aggression or paranoia very easily, which is why you get those phenomena. But you'll see a pressured nature sometimes with a distortion, and sometimes you'll see people shut down. You know, negative symptoms: wooden face, low movement, low expressiveness, and that can be a thought disorder. It can be other things too, but that can be a thought disorder. So those do respond. And I would say bipolar responds better than people that are actively schizophrenic. But it's kind of similar. It's a bit longer than ADHD or regular, let's say, PTSD or OCD or something. But there is a good response, and it's a very powerful tool. And neurofeedback is a very powerful tool for working on those phenomena. I will say with those phenomena, you're going to see different things across people. Usually the default mode network, you know, singulates are super hot. Behind the right ear, sensory and social will be a little bit off. But honestly, with people that are that dysregulated and suffering that hard, you should really be trying to get them to sleep. If you can do nothing else but get strongly and heavily dysregulated people sleeping better, sleeping more thoroughly, falling asleep at night, waking up in the morning, just that one first win will do 30, 40, 50% of what you're trying to get done. It'll have follow-on effects, knock-on effects on everything. So if you're doing neurofeedback professionally or on yourself, this is not just true if you have schizophrenia. Allowing it to fix your sleep and giving good feedback around your sleep should be in some ways your number one goal. If you don't have any sleep issues, watch how your sleep flexes and fluctuates after neurofeedback so you can give feedback to your provider or your coach, helping them tune your neurofeedback, because you will get sleep changes after a session, almost always, here and there. So it's a very useful tool. All right, some other questions here. Let me do a little bit of scrolling. Radar says he has to, I'm making an assumption, but Radar says he has to constantly ask people to repeat themselves because syllables are slightly slurred together. That is common, but he thinks it's worse for him. What gives? That may be something to do with that receptive language tissue behind the left ear. You could have a mild auditory processing issue that's specifically around speech. Now, what I would ask you, Radar, is does it happen mostly for speech? And is it much, much worse when you're in a room full of people trying to speak to each other and you can't listen to anyone talk because it all becomes Charlie Brown, mush in the background? If that's the case, it may be specific language tissue. It could also be that you have a hearing loss in the frequency that human voices often live in. So other things may sound just fine and crisp and clear, but that sort of upper mid-range bump that most human voices fall into could be a place where you have some hearing loss. That's a thing you can actually test pretty easily. Look at the pitch response across frequencies and do a bone conduction test and see how the nerves respond. If there's a hole in a big gap, then you'll know that's why for speech. And you can get both assistive devices as well as retrain the ear potentially to do different frequency detection, even with lost hair cells and damaged cochlea. So worth figuring out if it's actual auditory transduction layer, like you can't transduce that pitch frequency range, or if it's language, syllable, phoneme extraction, and then you can go after the brain itself. Either way, there's things you can do. So I'd encourage you to keep digging into unpack for you where that is in the way and solve it. Question from David asking, which frequency bands in the right front are associated with attachment? That's a great question, Dave. It's not so much cortical, it's more subcortical. We know it's right front because you get such a strong release of it when you train up slow frequencies in the theta range, typically, a very Seaburn-Fisher kind of thing to do. But we don't exactly know why. I think there's things that are, I think we're getting into periamygdalar cortex. The amygdala has no EEG, but tissue that's cortical that surrounds it and talks to it does have EEG. So I think we're getting into periamygdalar cortex when we tap into right front. But I also think that we're getting into the insula and to the tissue above the insula on the dorsolateral PFC, which has a big role around avoidance and sort of managing the intensity of effort and the difficulty of things. So you can sort of see how avoidance tissue and human attachment, relational attachment tissue could have some utility. You could use some similar resources, scanning for what isn't safe or for people that aren't nice or something, for instance. Or judging what is, appropriate or what is safe for you. This is probably why we get both rejection sensitivity and ADHD, splitting in borderline personality, rage and reactive attachment disorder when boundaries are set. It's all that right front tissue, I think. And again, periamygdalar and insular tissue. So look at the EEG and you'll probably see if someone's got anger, rage, resistance. I call that the problem child area, FT8. So look at the EEG, look at F4, F8, FT8. You can't always judge, of course, in the scalp EEG where it is in the brain, but it's often this right phenomena, and then you'll have this target in the cortex of alpha often. But if you don't see the cortical targets, then you're working potentially in subcortical tissues. And you have to kind of just go off the recipe books, a la Seaburn-Fisher, and now you're training theta up either at FP2 or FPO2. You might be training alpha up at PZ or alpha down at PZ. Both are done. I think Seaburn does a lot of her training these days, a lot, at IZ, at the Inian. And I think she's doing theta training there, but I'm not sure. So it's a little bit of a squirrely landscape. If you really want to get into attachment and relational work, which dovetails with trauma work, perhaps for obvious reasons, I'd encourage you to sit through some of the webinars and participate in some of the supervised, workshops that Seaburn's doing and learn her way. Seaburn-Fisher, also Ruth Lanius. You can go to YouTube and find some stuff. You can find some workshops that they have, previous ones you can watch in, I think the Eager Learning Group has some. There's a few different groups that have some as well. There's a couple on YouTube. But I would really dig into like the people who are doing the cutting edge work and developing those protocols, and don't take my word for what people do for attachment work, because I have a very particular way of thinking about the brain, and I tend to be a little bit like rigorously scientific until I'm looking at the data, and then I'm mixing some intuition when building protocols for somebody, of course. So, what I would tell you for protocols would never map perfectly to one person anyways, unless we're looking at their data and we can test ideas about, how they regulate when developing our protocols. So, all right, let's see. KAO, the notorious KAO. Have we had success in reducing bipolar? Yeah, I mentioned that about 10 minutes ago. Good success. It can be a little tricky. You gotta go very carefully. Generally want to work on the regulatory features of stress, sleep, and attention. If someone's got intrusive stuff like hallucinations or tics, those are worth targeting early on. But generally you want to work slowly and gradually and create just more resilience in somebody so they're less able to be flipped into different modes when it's true bipolar 1. And bipolar 2, I consider a bucket that is a mix of trauma, ADHD, sleep issues, and everything else. And people call it bipolar 2 because it doesn't fit other buckets. I'm not sure if that's valid, but that's sort of how I think about it. Other questions? Jay. Hello, Jay. Nice to see you, sir. C4PZ training helps my mood and energy a lot. Can it help with sleep quality and executive function as well? Usually helps with executive function quite a bit. I don't know if you can tell, but early on, watch the first few minutes of the video if you were not here. I was much lower energy and not as on as I am right now. It's already 7:30 at night or 7:15. I gotta maybe put this energy to use writing another article tonight or something. I don't know. But no, it helps with a lift of executive. It can help with mood, like it does for you, by bringing up the alpha speed. I think I'm getting some of that right now myself. For other people, it'll actually make you really anxious because their alpha doesn't tolerate being sped up. So it can be a little bit flaky. Also, C4 minus PZ, I would say that about half the time it'll screw with sleep. About a quarter of the time it'll do nothing to sleep. And then every so often it'll help sleep. But it's not really a good one for sleep. If you're looking for an SMR for sleep, that's not the one to pick. I often balance it, C4 minus PZ, with a segment of CZ minus A1 or C3 minus A1 beta, because then I'm getting my SMR or my beta in with that variant of C4, and I'm much less likely to erode sleep quality by manipulating my alpha. So that's what I think erodes sleep quality for C4 minus PZ. It's bringing up fast alpha. So alpha in general tends to not behave when you're training it, and tends to push back and tends to erode sleep. So you got to be careful training alpha, and often train other things along with it or around it or first, and then you'll be able to handle it better. Bonnie, drawing my attention as somebody asked about bipolar again. Thank you. Radar says training theta sounds sketch since it would reduce anxiety and perfusion. Training theta can both reduce anxiety or create the heck out of it really, really powerfully. Training theta up can shut off aspects of the mind. Training theta up can make people disinhibited or super anxious. It's really where and who and what do they look like now? And is there a good use case for that individual? And even then, test it carefully and slowly. So yeah, it's often sketch training up theta. And yet, Alpha-Theta neurofeedback trains up theta in the visual tissue and all that parietal association tissue that's making meaning of the world. And it creates a mode of receptive awareness of that tissue. So we start having visualizations and ideas and insight and putting information together and even literally visualizing, doing alpha-theta. And that's a state where we're bringing up alpha and theta, and then theta takes off and goes even higher and creates a release phenomena, the hypnagogic access state between awake and asleep. So training up theta is not always bad, but it's the kind of thing generally most neurofeedback doesn't train theta up, and we're often doing the opposite. We're often training theta down, because typically an excess of theta at rest in a QEEG, in a tissue or a chunk of brain, is going to be one of the failure modes that brain tissue's in. It's going to be stuck in high gear or disinhibited or sloppy in its regulation with tons of theta, usually. So we typically inhibit theta when it's excessive, but creating bursts of it in the short term to create healing experiences or release of emotions or visualization seems to be doable. So, bit of a mixed set of protocols. KAO is asking how I'm able to discuss specific protocols. Everyone else seems fearful to do so. Well, I'm not discussing protocols for you. I'm discussing in general the brain. That's sort of how I do my work anyways. I teach people about their brain. They know what they want to work on. And then if they want my help designing protocols, one of the secrets of protocol design is when you talk about a protocol for the brain, it's not like, and here's the button to push. It's like, and here's your starting place for your, to put into your workout. But you have to balance one protocol with lots of different things you're doing, multiple protocols, and you have to iterate based on what happens after a protocol. You have to change what you're doing. So talking about a particular protocol, C3 beta, C4SMR, and its general utility, I think for me is fine. I'm not saying, and this will work this way for you. And if you notice, whenever I describe a protocol, I often describe that it's working on the brain, not so much here's its impact. And ideally, I say things like, and it's designed to do something, it should do something, let's see if it does something. When I'm working with clients, those of you who are my clients, feel free to weigh in on this, but I tend to say things instead of our coaches like, hey, thanks for that report you gave us or that question you asked. Here's an adjustment. Here's why. It's designed to support you in this way, this way, this way, or this way. Please let us know if it does so we can adjust. And there's a lot of adjustment, a lot of iteration, especially in the first 50 sessions of someone's tailored work. And the more things you have going on, the more ways you're struggling, it can take a lot of individualized, iterative adjustments. So I'm okay helping people understand the landscape of the protocols that are out there, because, I can tell you that a curl helps your biceps, and that a squat is the compound. If you had to do one workout, do that one. But you could go get hurt doing squats wrong, and you don't need to just do squats. There's a whole process there. So this is sort of why I feel comfortable talking about how you manipulate different parts of the brain, because I'm not really giving you the plan. I'm just kind of orienting you to where the landscape is. That's my finessing of the ethics and the science at the same time. I'm an educator. I'm teaching you how to do things. So, another topic, Alpha-Theta and my variants. I'm not sure when to go into Alpha-Theta, Dave. It's a great topic. I might do that in a separate standalone non-Q&A video, just because I don't really want to set myself up and train in Alpha-Theta during these live streams. Close my eyes for 20 minutes. You guys can watch. Just look. But I'm happy to build a video that talks about Alpha-Theta and some variants, some history. I think it'd be a really useful video, because it's often not as well understood as other aspects of neurofeedback, and it's ridiculously powerful, as we know. So, Radar Ashwood's asking, a protocol for aphantasia. Well, aphantasia has an incidence rate of something like 15%, but it's also a spectrum and a continuum. So depending on the individual, you may find that, and I've seen this, that you get visualization during Alpha-Theta if you do occipital Alpha-Theta. But aphantasia can be complete, or it can be partial. And I don't know about working on the tissue necessarily if it's, complete, because I think it might be a normal variant. There may not be tissue to build in the right direction. Take myself as an example. I have fine phantasia. I visualize fine. But what I don't do is symbols in my mind, simple discrete symbols that have static rules, i.e. math. I don't do math. I don't have a math module in my right parietal area, the superior parietal area. The left, Wernicke's area for receptive language, mine's great. But the right one that's supposed to do math symbols, I don't have one. I have another language one over there. Instead, I found out in grad school, I have 2 language areas, no math area. Oh, okay, well then great. Words are wonderful. But this explains why I think in language, not in symbols, mathematical symbols, the way that my sister, who's a math genius, she does all kinds of advanced math, thinks nothing of it. I can do some high level concepts, but don't make me calculate the tip. It'll go wrong. Or right, depending on who's paying. But, so I don't know about aphantasia. I'm not sure if it's complete, if there's really no visualization. I'm not sure if it's a thing that has regulatory flexibility. It might, and I'd be curious to find out, Radar, but I'm not sure. Yeah. Let's see. Jay's asking or sharing our feedback. My feedback on Alpha-Theta on alpha training was super helpful. My feedback on alpha training was super helpful. Explains why doing FCPZ yesterday made you feel a little groggy, low mood, waking up in the morning. Yeah, you probably boosted your alpha, which I would bet was somewhat calming. And I don't know if you did a 4 to 7 or 12 to 20 inhibit, Jay, but whichever one you did, it's kind of relevant for sleep. But the 4 to 7, the 6.5 or the 7 hertz reward probably helped with your singulates and the goal that you asked about. But it might have resulted in your alpha lingering at a higher level and preventing deep sleep a little bit or eroding the quality. Now, that's not a very permanent effect. It tends to wear off. I think it's an exercise effect. The alpha's like rebounding a little bit as it settles. So, but it does happen. KAO, you're welcome. Radar, Dr. Hill, I don't think you have to actually do a protocol every stream. You can simply describe the protocol if it's complicated. Yeah, maybe, but that's the whole point. It's, it's neurofeedback and chill. So let me do some neurofeedback. It's also, you guys, most of you who show up to this stream are at this point old hats. We've had about 20 people show up tonight. Most of you who are answering questions, I know personally, you show up a lot and you really contribute a lot to the small community of biohackers on their brain we have now. But part of my goal is to make this a demystifying thing. So if I can stick wires to my head in real time while trying to teach and manage to do some neurofeedback, well, A, people can see it happening and realize it's not that complicated. And B, I can explain it while it's happening. And so people get every time the explanation. My main reason for doing this stuff is to teach people, but my ultimate goal is to get neurofeedback into everyone's hands if they want it as a tool and make it a usable tool, not this mysterious black box. So I do want to keep doing these neurofeedback and chills if that's what they are. But I might be changing some formats for the live stream the next week or two. You guys also probably know that on Wednesdays at 4 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Central, I participate in the Neuro Noodle podcast, which is a panel with Jay Gunkelman, often Santiago Brand, Joy Lunt, Dr. Mari Swingle, Pete Janssens. A few other folks show up as well. Josh Moore often. Jay did a 12 to 20 inhibit. Yep. Yeah, so Jay, if you switch it to a 4 to 7 on the low side, you might find that it doesn't screw with your sleep as much because then you're leaving the beta behind. You're leaving it out of the manipulation. And that might mean that you have enough robust SMR to take over and support it. So that's one thing you can try, but it doesn't usually help. Usually the alpha is the culprit there for sleep quality. You're, of course, welcome, Jay. Yes. Farbs is asking, is there an eyes open version of Alpha-Theta training? Yes, there is. Generally, the eyes open variants, doing Alpha-Theta eyes open, will mean that you don't go quite as deep, or maybe not that deep at all. And it's not done so much, and I don't think most of the software packages support it anymore. But for a while, there were training interfaces. So Alpha-Theta is often some sort of organic sound happening in the background. I use Eager, and it does water sounds, crashing ocean waves when theta is dominant, babbling brook when alpha's dominant and there's crossfade. On top of that, there's reward events, deep gongs for theta rewards happening, and chimes or bells for alpha happening. So, you can kind of hear the dominant sounds and know where you are, or if you're a therapist, listen to somebody's session and know what's happening a little bit in terms of their state. You can also watch a screen and watch for those, crossover states. But those are usually done eyes closed. But there are some older ways of doing alpha theta, and I believe this might still be built in. Someone who uses the software can tell us in the comments. But I think it's still built into the Signet system. Is an alpha theta suite. Signet from the Othmers largely does things below 1 hertz, infra low, infra slow types of things, which is not really the same landscape of the cortical brain waves we're talking about. But they do alpha theta as well, or at least the software, I believe, still supports it. And on top of water sounds, they have other alpha theta domains where they include things like rustling leaves in a forest breeze, and a crackling fire. So organic sounds. And those have visuals, all 3 of those, the water, the fire, and the forest leaves in the fall. They all have visuals. So you can gently stare at a not that bright screen, and you do get some of the same impact, but it kind of anchors you to this reality in this world. And alpha theta often takes you to other places. It's one of its benefits. So I think the theory here, my perspective on this, when I asked Siegfried Othmer, I said, really? Eyes open, alpha theta? Who uses that? Why would we use that? Because from my perspective, we're trying to create the visual states that are more accessible with eyes closed. And Siegfried, or maybe Sue Othmer, said to me, well, sometimes when there's trauma, this is a way of getting access to some of that state without getting someone to deeply dissociate, essentially, without destabilizing somebody. Now, I'm not a therapist. I probably would get somebody more resilient before going into alpha theta land. That's how I work through that, risk. But I can see how if you were deeply anxious and wanted to kind of rip the bandage off of trauma or attachment phenomena or lack of creativity or, feeling numb emotionally, you could do alpha theta. And if you did it eyes open, it might give you a dosing kind of control of how deep you got. So I think that's the theory behind eyes open KAO, but I have never done it, or rarely. I've had some clients do it who felt nervous during alpha theta. I had them do eyes open, and it worked fine. But they eventually decided to close their eyes during it. So, all right. Well, we've gone long tonight because you guys are a great audience. Thanks so much for participating. As always, I'm here to answer questions, so come find me. If you could do me a favor, the way you can support my channel and my educational journey here is leave comments in videos, subscribe if you aren't. If you really like something, share it out to a different social network. That gets a lot of attention to the YouTube algorithm when something pops up on someone's Facebook or LinkedIn channel and it comes back as a link to a video that you liked. So we're still a small channel. I'm still a small channel, just broke 1,000 people who've subscribed, but still pretty low viewership of only a few hundred viewers per video yet. So one of these days, someone will discover all this rich content and we'll get super excited and watch it all. But you guys in the short term get to shape how that works. And I will listen carefully to the things you're looking for and try to bring those into the next several videos. So until I talk to you again, have a lovely evening or afternoon. Take care of those brains, and I'll talk to you.